Greetings. My name is Joshua Rivera Melendez. I'm from the Department of Biology in the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras campus. And today I will be presenting what I've been working on with the NRCT program. Today we're just pretty much going to be talking about what we think about the soil in our yards. So now for starters, let's talk about residential soils because this is what we're going to be talking about further on. How are residential soils formed? So the formation of residential soils consists of numerous processes controlled by humans. The first one being the superficial layers of the ground are removed. Now, the second part is when new materials are brought in to generate new layers that favor construction. And then lastly, the new material is compacted, so then the building infrastructure is easier. So now let's talk about some of the benefits of residential soils. For the most part, residential soils can provide habitat in which plants and other organisms can live. They also help with the retention and supply of resources for plants and other soil organisms. Um, Additionally, it also helps with the interception of contaminants and carbon sequestration. The following image is an image of one of the houses that we went to interview and collect samples from, where you can see a diverse range of plant species, which overall forms an ecosystem coexisting with the residents. Now, what are some of the properties of residential soils? Each residential soil will provide different benefits depending on their physical, chemical, biological, and cultural properties. For starters, physical properties refers to the color, the texture, and the structure of the soil. One of the most important physical properties can be referred to as the texture. This is because the texture refers to the distribution of particle sizes in the soil and its ability to absorb water. Now, the retention of water in the soil ultimately affects the growth of the plants and the other the organisms that coexist with the plants. Soil texture also affects structure because it has a major influence in form, stability, and resilience of soil structure. So, pretty much, soil texture is very important because it affects the structure of the soil and it also affects the retention of water. Now, in the following image, we can see the different particles of soil. This is what we're talking about when we talk about particles of soil. So, over here, we have sand. In the middle part, we have silt. And then lastly, we have clay. So, the bigger the particle is, the easier it will be for the water to flow through it and pretty much drain. The smaller it is, so when we're talking about clay, the space between the particles is so small that the water tends to accumulate. So this is known as waterlogging. And what we see is that the water accumulates and then it can't be absorbed very well to the plant roots. So the most fertile ground will be that consists of sand and clay, which is referred to as silt, because we have the big particles that allow the water to filtrate, and then the small particles that allow some of the water to be retained within the roots of the plant. This is very important because these physical properties contribute to the growth of the plant. Now, chemical properties. The chemical properties refer to the presence and accessibility of essential minerals and nutrients for the plant. So, when we're talking about chemical properties, we're talking about the nutritious aspect of the soil. So, how the soil provides what the plant needs in order for it to grow. There has to be a balance in the concentration of minerals and chemicals in the soil to determine the fertility. And when we're measuring um, the balance, we can also talk about pH because this refers to the acidity and the alkalinity of the soil. The alkalinity and the acidity also relates to the cation and anion exchange capacity, which ultimately affects the ability of the plants to absorb and release nutrients. So, what we're going to see here in the following image is that in acidic soil, we see that the distribution there isn't a balance between the cations and the anions, and then what this does is that the availability of nutrients within the soil is limited. Now over here where we have a higher concentration of anions, negative charged particles, we also see that there is a lack of nutrients. So a just right would be between both of them, where we have both cations and anions, which help with plant uptake. It makes uptake more available for the plant. So biological properties. The biological properties refer to anything that has to do with the direct and indirect influence of living organisms inhabiting the soil. So plants, organisms, microorganisms which live in the soil, and how they ultimately contribute to the underground ecosystem. Um, an image that represents the biological properties of soil is this following image, where we can see the process of photosynthesis. As we know, plants absorb CO2 and they release oxygen. Now you might be asking yourself, oh, what happens to the carbon? Well, the carbon is stored in the structure of the plant and in the roots of the plant. So this is known as carbon sequestration, and this is a very important aspect of the underground soil ecosystem, which many people tend to not focus on. So we see that there's an interaction between the microbial biomass and the plant biomass, and this retains carbon, which is important to climate mitigation. So now, lastly, cultural properties. The cultural properties of the soil refer to the types of uses people give to their soil. So this can be anything from whether or not the person plants on their soil, whether or not they use fertilizer, whether or not they compact the soil before they plant in it, and it also refers to recreational uses given to soil. So whether or not you use it as a playground, whether or not you use it for your pets, if you use it for spiritual practices, all of these things are just cultural properties because collectively a culture decides what importance to give to soil. So when we talk about cultural properties, it's just any cultural benefit that the soil provides to the people and how the people themselves interact with soil. This is overall very important because you can have all the other properties be balanced, but if the person who's taking care of the soil is negligent and isn't aware of the consequences of their actions when they're dealing with soil, well, then they're going to have um, a not very healthy ecosystem underneath their plants in the soil. So these are just some images of fertilizing plants and compactation. Those are cultural properties. So now, what do we already know about residential soils? So according to literature, the quality of soil is a crucial part of every ecosystem, yet many people, especially those in urban areas, aren't aware of its importance. According to a study done by Johnson and Catley in 2009, people tend to have a negative perspective of soil as they see it as dirt or filth. So these negative connotations that people associate with soil lead them to see soil as a disease fostering substrate. Now, having a negative connotation towards soil doesn't benefit it, because if you have a negative connotation towards soil, then how are you going to take care of it? So, additionally, we also see that there is a lack of discussion of underground um, biomes within the soil when people are going to research and investigate green infrastructures and some of the green actions that we can take to help climate. So it's important for us to start discussing more on soils because they are a crucial part of the ecosystem and many people tend to neglect them. So for this research, what we did is we generated a question, and the research question was, how do people perceive soils, residential soils specifically? So keeping in mind that people who typically live in urban areas aren't very connected to their soil, and they tend to have a negative connotation towards soil, we formulated a hypothesis in which we said that considering that urban dwellers have much less contact with soil and generally perceive soil as a disease fostering substrate, people will regard residential soil solely as a cultural element of their property, primarily using it for constructions and plant growth, overlooking the rest of its beneficial contributions to the environment. So now, the method. The method for this research was that we asked 280 people in the north region of the Rio Piedras Basin about the soil in their yards. The three questions that we focused on were: one, the benefits. What benefits does the soil on your yard provide to you? Two, what differences are there between the soil in your yard and that of a forest? And three, what are the differences between the different types of soils? So just so we can have a general um, intake on what they already know about the soil. So the results for the first question, what benefits does a soil to your yard provide? We see that most people answered food. Now it's important to note that this image is not statistical data. We did use statistical data to create it, but this is not a statistical representation of the results of our experiment. This is just a representation, a visual representation for you guys to be able to see it better. But food and climate regulation were the most prevalent answers. So now when we see the graph, we see obviously that food, climate regulation, and spiritual and inspirational practices are the main um, results. Now, food is drastically above climate regulation because we had 138 people answer that. And it's important to note that when they're talking about climate regulation, they're referring to the temperature, the the local changes in temperature when there's plants present. So this just shows how people, when they think about soil, yes, soil contributes to plants, but it's hard for them to just visualize soil and its benefits. They visualize climate regulation, but in terms of the plants around their yard being able to change the climate and making it a little bit cooler in the summer. So overall, we could see that the most people saw a cultural benefit from their yard from this question. The second question was, what are the differences between the soils from your yard and the soil from a forest? Now, the biggest answer was management and flora. So when we look at the graph, we see that most people answered management. Approximately 87 people answered that management was the biggest difference. This has to do with cultural properties of soil because they tend to see that their yard is way more managed than that of a forest, which is understandable, but it just comes to show that their idea of soil itself has a lot to do with cultural elements. And then secondly, we see that they perceive the forest to have way more flora than their own yard. So it also shows that they don't perceive their yards to be as important in the ecosystem because it doesn't have as much flora as a forest. So the third question was, what are the differences between different types of soils? And most people answered texture and hydrology. So when we look at the graph, texture, an overwhelming amount of people consider texture to be a big difference between the different types of soils. So people were able to identify that there's rocky soils, there's muddy soils, there's soils that are composed more of sand, and this just comes to show that people typically have a good understanding of the physical properties of soil. And then the second most answered question was hydrology. When they talk about hydrology, they tend to see the humidity of the soil. So they compared soils that are humid and soils that aren't humid. So typically, people do have a general perspective of the physical properties of soil, but they seem to fail in understanding that there is a chemical component of soil and there's a biological component when comparing different soils. We see that flora, when we're talking about the differences in different types of soils, flora was very low compared to the other graphs where we see that they're identifying flora being a big difference between soils from forests and from their own yard. So now what can we conclude from these results? We see that people often regarded residential soils as a cultural element with some idea of the environmental benefits they provide. But after answering our questions, they supported the main idea of the hypotheses, which is that most people will regard residential soils as a cultural element of their property. Surprisingly, however, some residents were also aware of the environmental benefits of residential soils, as they mentioned climate regulation, but when they identified climate regulation, they did so in a more local level and not a global level. So they weren't able to identify the soil itself being able to help climate regulation. They just looked at the stuff that grows on top of the soil, which also proves the lack of information that people have on urban soils and their importance in the ecosystem. So lastly, here are our resources. And then further on, we have acknowledgments. So we have want to give an acknowledgement to the University of Puerto Rico, the USDA NRCT program, the Tropical Plant Ecology and Urban Systems Labor, the Department of Environmental Sciences, as they are providing these programs for students in the University of Puerto Rico, and Residential Soils PR. Thank you guys so much for your attention and have a good day.